Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to the world of ancient Greece, a place that modern politicians, history teachers, and enthusiastic documentary narrators absolutely love to describe as the birthplace of democracy. And that sounds wonderful. A civilization of philosophers, free citizens, public debate, and noble ideals. A place where wise men gathered beneath sunny skies to discuss the future of society. A place where the voice of the people mattered. At least that's the version we usually hear. Because tonight, we're going to spend some time with the actual Greeks. The real ones, the complicated ones, the occasionally brilliant and frequently chaotic people who invented democracy and then spent centuries arguing about whether it was a terrible idea. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slow journeys through history. And while you're down there, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Maybe it's late at night in London. Maybe the sun is just coming up somewhere in Australia. Or maybe you're wrapped in a blanket at 2 in the morning, wondering why humanity keeps inventing systems of government and immediately regretting them. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe put your phone on the charger, because ancient Greeks had many talents, but inventing battery life was not one of them. And let's gently drift back nearly 2,500 years. The first thing we need to understand is that the ancient Greeks did not think of democracy the way modern people do. Not even close. Today, democracy is often treated almost like a sacred word. People praise it, governments defend it, politicians claim to represent it. Entire wars have been fought in its name. For many modern societies, democracy is considered the default good option. If a country is democratic, that's generally viewed as positive. If it isn't, people start asking uncomfortable questions. But when ancient Greeks talked about democracy, the conversation was much messier. Many Greeks admired democracy. Many others absolutely hated it. And some of the smartest people who ever lived looked at democratic government and basically said, "Are we sure this is a good idea? Let's begin in Athens." Because of course we have to. Whenever democracy comes up, Athens enters the conversation almost immediately. The city became famous for developing what historians often call direct democracy. Not representative democracy, direct democracy. That distinction matters. Modern democracies usually involve electing representatives. You vote. Then somebody else goes and makes decisions. In ancient Athens, many citizens simply showed up and voted themselves. No middleman, no representative, no carefully crafted campaign advertisements, no television debates, no political consultants earning enormous amounts of money to explain why ordinary words should be replaced with confusing slogans. Citizens gathered together and voted directly on important issues. At least in theory, the key phrase here is citizens, because Athens had a very specific definition of who counted as one. Women? No. Enslaved people? Definitely not. Foreign residents? Also no. Children? No again. In practice, only adult male citizens could fully participate, which means the famous Athenian democracy excluded most people living in Athens. This is one of those moments where history gently reminds us that words can change meaning over time. When Athenians spoke about rule by the people, they were referring to a much smaller group than modern audiences usually imagine. Still, among those citizens, political participation was remarkably active. Thousands of men attended assemblies. They listened to speeches. They debated policies. They voted on laws. They discussed war and peace. They made decisions that affected the entire city, and sometimes those decisions were surprisingly sensible. Other times, they were spectacularly questionable. Because democracy, as it turns out, does not magically prevent bad ideas. This was something Greeks noticed very quickly. Imagine standing in a massive crowd. Thousands of people are shouting opinions. Everyone believes they are correct. Everyone thinks everyone else is an idiot. Someone gives a speech. The crowd cheers. Another person gives a speech. Now the crowd changes its mind. A third person arrives. The crowd changes its mind again. Congratulations. You have just experienced one of humanity's oldest political traditions. Athens was not immune to emotional decision-making. In fact, it occasionally specialized in it. Citizens could become angry, excited, fearful, patriotic, suspicious, and politicians learned how to influence those emotions. Some speakers became incredibly skilled at persuading crowds. Critics worried that democracy allowed talented manipulators to gain power. This concern appears again and again in Greek writings. One famous critic was the philosopher Plato. Plato was not exactly democracy's biggest fan. In fact, he spent a remarkable amount of time explaining why ordinary people probably should not be running governments. Now, to be fair, Plato also believed philosophers should rule society, which is the sort of proposal that sounds wonderful if you happen to be a philosopher. Plato watched Athens make mistakes. He watched crowds support poor decisions. He watched political leaders appeal to emotions instead of wisdom. One of his favorite comparisons involved ships. Imagine, he said, a large ship at sea. The passengers vote on how to navigate. Most of them know nothing about sailing. The trained navigator is ignored. The loudest voices win. The ship drifts toward disaster. For Plato, this was democracy, a system where expertise could be overwhelmed by popularity, a system where knowledge lost to persuasion, a system where crowds sometimes rewarded confidence more than competence. He was deeply skeptical, and honestly, many people throughout history have shared that concern. But Plato's student, Aristotle, had a somewhat different view. Aristotle was more analytical, less dramatic, more interested in categorizing things. If Plato looked at politics and saw a disaster waiting to happen, Aristotle looked at politics and immediately started building a filing system. He classified governments into different types: rule by one person, rule by a few people, rule by many people. Each category had strengths. Each category had weaknesses. Democracy, in Aristotle's view, wasn't automatically perfect or terrible. It depended on how it functioned. This was a very Greek way of approaching problems. The Greeks loved arguing about systems. They loved definitions. They loved classifications. They loved creating elaborate intellectual frameworks for understanding human behavior. And they especially loved disagreeing with one another. If you gathered 10 educated Athenians in a room, there was a reasonable chance they would produce 12 opinions. The more we study Greek political thought, the more we realize there was never one single Greek opinion about democracy. There were many. Some citizens loved it. Some distrusted it. Some feared mob rule. Some feared tyranny. Some worried about corruption. Others worried about inequality. Many concerns that sound surprisingly modern, because human nature has not changed as much as we'd like to believe. People in ancient Athens worried about misinformation. They worried about selfish leaders. They worried about political polarization. They worried about voters making emotional choices. And they worried about wealthy individuals gaining too much influence. In other words, they were dealing with many of the same problems that still appear in political discussions today. just with fewer smartphones and significantly more sandals. Let's drift for a moment into daily life. Imagine you're an ordinary Athenian citizen, not rich, not famous, not a philosopher whose ideas will survive for thousands of years. Just a regular citizen. You might spend part of your day working, part of your day socializing, and occasionally part of your day participating in government. Political involvement wasn't some distant activity conducted by professionals. It was woven into civic life. Citizens were expected to engage, to listen, to vote, to contribute. The ideal citizen was not passive. He was active, engaged. The Greeks even had a word that eventually gave us the English term idiot. Originally, it referred to someone focused only on private concerns. Now that's an oversimplification, but it reflects an important cultural value. Citizens were supposed to care about the community. Political participation was considered part of being a responsible member of society. Of course, actually achieving that ideal was another matter entirely. People have always been people. Some citizens were informed, some weren't. Some were thoughtful, some weren't. Some attended assemblies regularly, others preferred staying home. Human behavior remained stubbornly human, and that reality created endless debate about whether democracy could truly work. As the years passed, Athens became famous throughout the Greek world. Its democratic institutions attracted attention, admiration, suspicion, and criticism. Other Greek city-states watched carefully. Not every city copied Athens. In fact, many deliberately chose different paths, and that's where our story becomes even more interesting. Because once we leave Athens, we discover that the Greek world was far from united in its political beliefs. Some cities looked at democracy and saw freedom. Others looked at democracy and saw chaos. And nowhere was that contrast more dramatic than in Athens' greatest rival, the famously disciplined, famously austere, and famously opinionated city of Sparta. And unfortunately, for democracy's reputation, the Spartans had plenty to say about what they thought was wrong with letting crowds run things. As we gently continue our journey through the political arguments of ancient Greece, let's float away from Athens for a while. The marble temples fade into the distance. The crowded assemblies become quieter. The endless public debates slowly disappear. And in their place, we arrive at a city that looked at Athenian democracy and essentially said, absolutely not. Welcome to Sparta, a city that has become almost mythical in modern culture. Movies love Sparta. Video games love Sparta. Fitness influencers occasionally love Sparta. And every few years, someone discovers a documentary about Spartan warriors and suddenly decides breakfast is a sign of weakness. The real Sparta, however, was stranger than the legend. And more importantly, Sparta had a very different understanding of government. If Athens was a loud public meeting that never ended, Sparta was more like a strict household run by people who believed fun was dangerous. The Spartans valued discipline, order, obedience, stability. They were deeply suspicious of anything that looked too unpredictable, including democracy. Now, Sparta was not a simple dictatorship. Ancient Greek governments had an annoying tendency to be complicated. Sparta actually combined several different political elements. It had kings, yes, plural, 2 kings at the same time, because apparently one king seemed risky, so the solution was 2 kings, which sounds logical until you remember humans spend history arguing. Still, the Spartans believed this arrangement prevented too much power from accumulating. Alongside the kings existed councils, magistrates, and assemblies. The system mixed monarchy, oligarchy, and limited popular participation. It was designed specifically to avoid the extremes that worried Greek thinkers. The Spartan goal was not freedom. The Spartan goal was stability, and stability was treated almost like a sacred value. This difference helps explain why many Greeks disagreed about democracy. It was about what government was supposed to accomplish. Athenians often emphasized participation. Spartans emphasized order. Athenians celebrated public debate. Spartans preferred fewer arguments and more obedience. Athenians encouraged citizens to speak. Spartans encouraged citizens to listen. You can probably imagine how these two societies felt about each other. Athens often viewed Sparta as rigid and backward. Sparta often viewed Athens as chaotic, undisciplined, and dangerously impulsive. To be fair, both sides had evidence. Athens could become wildly emotional. Sparta could become stubbornly inflexible. Human societies rarely achieve perfection. One fascinating aspect of Greek political thought is that these disagreements happened openly. Greeks loved discussing government, absolutely loved it. Imagine spending an afternoon in a marketplace. Someone is debating justice. Another is debating citizenship. Another group is debating military policy. Meanwhile, a philosopher has somehow turned the question of lunch into a 4-hour discussion about the nature of existence. This constant debate produced history's most influential political ideas. It also produced an impressive amount of confusion. Take democracy. Supporters argued citizens should govern themselves. Critics immediately asked what happens when citizens make terrible decisions. Supporters responded that collective wisdom would prevail. Critics pointed out that crowds occasionally panic, and around the discussion went. The remarkable thing is how familiar these arguments still sound. Modern democracies continue wrestling with many of the same questions. How much power should ordinary citizens have? How much influence should experts have? Ancient Greeks never found final answers. Neither have we. Let's wander back toward Athens for a moment, because one event profoundly shaped Greek attitudes toward democracy: the long and exhausting Peloponnesian War. This war lasted for decades. Entire generations grew up knowing little else. It drained resources, destroyed lives, and transformed Greek politics. When the conflict began, many Athenians were confident. Athens possessed wealth, naval power, and cultural influence. What could possibly go wrong? The war became a grinding struggle. Victories were followed by setbacks. Optimism gave way to anxiety. Public opinion shifted repeatedly. During crises, citizens often become more emotional. Fear, uncertainty, and war changes behavior. Athens experienced all three. One particularly famous example involved the Sicilian expedition. The plan sounded impressive. Supporters promised success. Crowds approved the proposal, and then things went very badly. The expedition ended in disaster. Ships were lost. Soldiers died. Resources vanished. Athens suffered a devastating blow. For critics of democracy, this became a perfect example. Look, they said, the people were persuaded. The assembly voted. The policy failed catastrophically. Supporters responded that bad decisions happen under every government. Kings, aristocrats, and generals make mistakes. Why should democracy alone be blamed? Perhaps the most famous example involves the trial of Socrates. A democratic jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. Many later thinkers viewed this as evidence of democracy's dangers. How could a society famous for wisdom condemn one of its most famous philosophers? Watching his teacher die did not improve Plato's opinion of democratic politics. Some of the strongest critiques of democracy emerged directly from Athens itself. Another interesting feature involved selection by lot. Many public offices were filled randomly. The Greeks worried elections favored the wealthy and popular. Random selection, they believed, gave ordinary citizens a chance. The Athenians were constantly experimenting. They weren't following a blueprint, they were inventing one. The truth is that Greek democracy was never a finished product. It's like an ongoing renovation project where everyone disagrees about the floor plan. The Romans, in particular, paid close attention. Many Roman thinkers became fascinated by Greek debates about democracy, citizenship, power, and public participation. The Greeks had not solved politics, but they had asked the right questions. Questions that still echo through legislative chambers and dinner table arguments. Which brings us to the fascinating world of Greek political theory, where philosophers attempted the impossible task of explaining human beings to themselves, a project that, as you may have noticed, remains unfinished. As we continue drifting through the world of ancient Greece, let's leave the battlefields and public assemblies behind for a while. The shouting politicians can continue arguing without us. They probably won't notice we're gone. Instead, let's wander into a quieter place, a shaded courtyard, a small gathering of students, perhaps a few scrolls lying nearby, and somewhere in the middle sits a philosopher trying to answer one of humanity's oldest questions. Why do governments become disasters? It's a simple question, a timeless question, and judging by thousands of years of political history, apparently a very difficult one. The Greeks were fascinated by this problem, not because they expected perfection. Most Greek thinkers were far too realistic for that. They knew human beings were flawed. People were selfish, emotional, greedy, proud, impulsive, and occasionally willing to ruin an entire city because they lost an argument. The challenge was creating political systems that could survive those flaws. This concern appears everywhere in Greek political thought. The debate wasn't simply about democracy, it was about human nature itself. Could ordinary people govern wisely? Could elites govern wisely? Could kings govern wisely? More importantly, could anybody govern wisely? The answer often seemed to be, maybe for a while. Let's return briefly to Aristotle, because Aristotle approached politics with the energy of a man determined to categorize absolutely everything: plants, animals, ethics, logic, government. If something existed, Aristotle wanted to classify it, and political systems were no exception. He examined governments across the Greek world. Then he developed a framework that would influence political thought for centuries. According to Aristotle, governments could be divided into several basic forms: rule by one person, rule by a few people, rule by many people. Simple enough. But Aristotle added an important twist. Each form could exist in a healthy version or a corrupted version. A monarchy might become tyranny. An aristocracy might become oligarchy. Government by many could become something unstable and self-serving. The key issue wasn't simply who ruled. The key issue was whether rulers governed for the common good or for themselves. This was a remarkably sophisticated insight. Even today, political scientists still wrestle with similar questions. Power itself isn't always the problem. The use of power is. A wise ruler and a terrible ruler may possess the same authority. The results can be dramatically different. The Greeks understood this very well. They had seen enough history to know that institutions matter. But character matters too. A city could have excellent laws and still suffer under bad leadership. A city could have flawed institutions and occasionally thrive under capable leaders. Human beings complicated everything. As usual, one thing that often surprises modern audiences is how skeptical many Greeks were about pure democracy, not because they hated freedom, not because they loved oppression, but because they worried about instability. Imagine being an Athenian philosopher. You watch crowds gather, you hear speeches, you observe public opinion, changing from week to week. One day the city supports a policy. The next day it opposes it. A charismatic speaker appears. The crowd changes direction again. From a philosopher's perspective, this could look deeply concerning. Political decisions affected thousands of lives. Should those decisions depend on whichever speaker happened to be most persuasive? That afternoon, many Greeks thought not. This fear gave rise to one of their favorite criticisms: the danger of demagogues. A demagogue was essentially a political figure who gained influence by appealing to emotions and popular desires. The word still exists today, and the concept remains familiar. Critics worried that democratic societies rewarded persuasion more than wisdom. The best speaker might defeat the most knowledgeable speaker. The most entertaining speaker might defeat the most responsible speaker. In modern language, we might say the Greeks were worried about style defeating substance, a concern that feels surprisingly current. Some things never change. Technology changes, clothing changes, architecture changes, but human beings remain strangely consistent. Give people a confident speaker, and many will follow. Give people a complicated expert, and many will become distracted. The Greeks noticed this long ago. Now, it's important not to imagine all philosophers sitting around complaining about democracy. Many recognized its strengths. After all, democracy offered protections against tyranny, and Greeks hated tyranny. Absolutely hated it. The word tyrant originally referred to a ruler who seized power outside traditional legal structures. Over time, it acquired increasingly negative meanings. For good reason. Greek history contained numerous examples of rulers accumulating excessive authority. Once power concentrated in a single individual, removing that individual could become extremely difficult. This frightened many citizens. A democracy might make mistakes, but at least citizens retained some influence. A tyrant could make mistakes on a far larger scale, and there might be nobody capable of stopping him. The Greeks had witnessed enough ambitious leaders to understand the danger. In fact, Greek political thought often resembled an endless balancing act. Too much democracy risked instability. Too much concentrated power risked tyranny. Too much aristocratic control risked oligarchy. Too much military influence risked authoritarian rule. Every solution created new risks. Every advantage carried disadvantages. It was less like solving a puzzle and more like managing a permanent headache. Let's gently shift toward another fascinating aspect of Greek democracy: its dependence on participation. Modern democracies often function even when many citizens remain disengaged. Ancient Athens expected active involvement. Citizens attended assemblies, served on juries, participated in public discussions, held offices, performed civic duties. The system demanded time, energy, attention. This expectation reflected a broader Greek belief. Citizenship was not simply a legal status, it was a responsibility. A citizen was supposed to contribute to public life. Political participation formed part of personal identity. To many Greeks, withdrawing completely from civic affairs seemed irresponsible. The community depended upon engagement. Of course, maintaining that level of participation wasn't easy. People had jobs, families, businesses, personal concerns. Ancient citizens were still ordinary human beings. Some undoubtedly cared more about politics than others. And that's another recurring theme in Greek political thought, the tension between ideals and reality. Greek philosophers often described ideal citizens, ideal rulers, ideal governments. Actual humans stubbornly refused to cooperate. Reality remained inconvenient. Imagine designing the perfect government for perfectly rational people. Wonderful. Now introduce actual people. Suddenly, everything becomes much harder. This realization appears repeatedly throughout Greek literature. People are emotional. People become angry. People become jealous. People become frightened. People pursue personal interests. Political systems must account for those realities. Ignoring them usually ends badly. One reason Greek political ideas survived for so long is that they addressed universal problems. The Greeks weren't merely discussing Athens or Sparta or individual city-states. They were examining broader questions about power, questions that apply almost everywhere. Who should rule? Why should they rule? How can power be controlled? How can corruption be limited? What obligations do citizens have? What obligations do leaders have? These questions remain remarkably relevant. You could transport many Greek political debates into the modern world, and people would immediately recognize them. The details would change. The technology would change. The vocabulary would change. But the underlying concerns would remain familiar. And perhaps that's one reason ancient Greece continues to fascinate us. The Greeks feel distant, yet strangely recognizable. Their world contained temples instead of office buildings, triremes instead of airplanes, scrolls instead of smartphones. Yet they worried about leadership, misinformation, inequality, and public trust. Very modern concerns. As the classical period progressed, these debates became increasingly sophisticated. Writers analyzed constitutions. Philosophers proposed reforms. Historians evaluated successes and failures. Political theory evolved into a serious intellectual discipline. Some thinkers emphasized virtue. Others emphasized institutions. Some trusted citizens. Others trusted experts. Nobody agreed on everything, which, ironically, may have been the most democratic aspect of Greek intellectual life. Disagreement was constant and often encouraged. This atmosphere helped produce extraordinary creativity. Greek thinkers challenged assumptions, questioned traditions, examined political systems critically. Even cherished institutions were subjected to scrutiny. Nothing escaped debate for long. Not democracy, not monarchy, not aristocracy, not religion, not education, not even philosophy itself. The Greeks argued about everything, and because they argued about everything, they left behind a treasure trove of ideas, some brilliant, some questionable, some surprisingly funny, some deeply insightful, many still worth discussing. As the centuries rolled forward, however, the political independence of the Greek city-states began to weaken. New powers emerged. Old rivalries persisted. The Greek world changed, and eventually, a young king from the northern kingdom of Macedon would transform everything. A man whose rise would force Greeks to reconsider many assumptions about power, citizenship, and democracy. A man who would become one of history's most famous rulers. And somewhat awkwardly for democratic ideals, he would achieve his success not through assemblies and public voting, but through monarchy. His name was Alexander the Great, and his story would reshape the political landscape of the ancient world. As we continue our slow journey through ancient Greece, let's leave behind the philosophers for a little while. They're still arguing. Of course, they always are. Somewhere, Plato is explaining why philosophers should govern. Somewhere else, Aristotle is categorizing governments into increasingly detailed categories. And somewhere nearby, an exhausted citizen is probably wishing everyone would stop discussing political theory and simply decide what they're doing. But history has other plans, because while Athens debated, while Sparta disciplined, while philosophers analyzed, a new power was quietly growing to the north, the kingdom of Macedon. For many years, southern Greeks looked down on the Macedonians. Quite a lot, actually. The Macedonians spoke a Greek dialect, shared many cultural traditions, worshipped familiar gods, yet many Athenians still viewed them as rough around the edges, less sophisticated, less refined, the sort of people who probably spent more time riding horses than discussing philosophy. To be fair, they absolutely did spend more time riding horses than discussing philosophy, and that turned out to be surprisingly useful, because while the Greek city-states continued their endless rivalries, Macedon was becoming stronger, much stronger. The architect of this transformation was Philip II of Macedon. Philip was intelligent, practical, patient, and perhaps most importantly, he understood something many Greek city-states struggled to accept. Constantly fighting each other was not an ideal long-term strategy. Greek history before Philip often resembles an endless cycle of alliances, betrayals, wars, recoveries, and then more wars. Philip watched all of this carefully. Then he built one of the most effective military systems in the ancient world. His army became disciplined, professional, organized, dangerously competent. Eventually, Philip established dominance over much of Greece. And here's where things become politically interesting. Many Greeks valued self-government. Many Greeks admired democracy. Many Greeks cherished independence. Yet increasingly, their future would be shaped by kings. Not assemblies, not citizen voting, not democratic debate. Kings. This created a fascinating contradiction. Greek thinkers spent generations discussing ideal governments. Then reality arrived, carrying a spear. After Philip's assassination, power passed to his son, a young man whose name would echo through history, Alexander. He inherited a powerful kingdom, conquered enormous territories, defeated major empires. Alexander's rise posed an awkward question for defenders of democracy. What happens when one ruler achieves more than countless assemblies? This was not a comfortable topic. After all, democratic ideals emphasized collective participation. Alexander embodied individual leadership. People often want neat conclusions. Democracy works, monarchy fails. History usually responds by creating examples that challenge everyone, and throughout his empire, political power flowed from the top downward, not upward from citizens, through a king, a very successful king. Let's slow down and consider another irony. Athens is remembered as the birthplace of democracy. Alexander is remembered as a great conqueror. One charismatic leader makes a simpler story than thousands of citizens debating tax policy. This isn't unique to Greece. In truth, Greek political thought contains a constant tension between collective wisdom and individual excellence. After Alexander's death, things became even more complicated. His empire fragmented, generals competed for power, kingdoms emerged. Yet Greek discussions about democracy never disappeared. Philosophers continued writing. The debates survived. Ideas often travel farther than armies. A military victory can reshape borders. A powerful idea can reshape centuries. The arguments may be ancient, but their influence remains surprisingly modern. Ordinary Athenians, the people who showed up to assemblies, served on juries, listened to speeches, a tradition that may be one of humanity's oldest institutions. And so, as our slow journey through ancient Greece comes to an end, we arrive at a conclusion that is both simple and surprisingly complicated. The ancient Greeks did not view democracy the way we do. They did not treat it as a sacred ideal. They did not assume it was automatically the best form of government, and they certainly did not believe it solved all political problems. Instead, they argued about it constantly, endlessly, almost professionally. Some Greeks loved democracy because it gave citizens a voice. Others feared it because crowds could be emotional. Some saw freedom. Others saw instability. Some trusted ordinary citizens. Others trusted experts, aristocrats, or strong rulers. The truth is that ancient Greece was never one unified political experiment. It was a collection of competing ideas, cities, and philosophies. Athens became famous because it pushed democracy further than almost anyone else. But even in Athens, people questioned whether democracy always worked. Men like Plato spent their lives worrying about whether popularity could overpower wisdom. Aristotle spent years analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of different systems. And countless ordinary citizens spent their afternoons listening to speeches and wondering whether the person speaking actually knew what they were talking about, which, if we're being honest, may be one of the most timeless political experiences imaginable. Perhaps the most important lesson the Greeks left behind isn't that democracy is perfect. It's that democracy requires participation, debate, and responsibility. The Greeks never stopped asking difficult questions. They questioned leaders, institutions, and traditions, and occasionally, they questioned whether the entire system was working at all. That habit of questioning may be their greatest political legacy, the idea that government should not simply happen to people, that citizens should have some role in shaping the world around them. Its roots can be found in those crowded Athenian assemblies where thousands of citizens gathered beneath the Mediterranean sun to argue about the future, and argue some more, because nobody in human history has ever loved a political argument quite as much as the ancient Greeks. So tonight, as we leave behind the philosophers and endlessly debating citizens, remember this: the Greeks didn't invent modern democracy. They invented the conversation about democracy, and humanity has been continuing that conversation ever since. For now, though, the assembly is finally adjourned. The speeches are over. The philosophers have run out of daylight. The politicians have temporarily stopped talking, a miracle in itself. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. Tonight we're in Rome, ancient Rome specifically, somewhere around the 1st century BCE, give or take a decade of political chaos. The city smells like bread, sewage, and ambition, which is honestly not that different from most modern capitals. But we won't go there. Tonight's question is a deceptively simple one. How did ancient Romans actually feel about Julius Caesar? Now, if your brain immediately jumped to, they loved him, well, sort of. And if your brain jumped to, they hated him, that's why they stabbed him 23 times. Also sort of. The truth, as with most things in Roman history, is a wonderfully murky puddle of contradictions. Political theater, personal grudges, and genuine admiration all swirling together in one very complicated toga. So dim the lights, put your phone face down. Let's settle in with one of history's most misunderstood men, and more interestingly, with the people who had to live through him. We'll start not with Caesar himself, but with the Rome he was born into, because you can't understand how people felt about him without understanding just how exhausted everyone already was before He even showed up. Rome in the late Republic was not a happy place. It was a city that had spent the better part of a century tearing itself apart. The old system, the Senate, the consuls, the careful balance of aristocratic power, was creaking badly. Land inequality was brutal. The gap between the very rich and the very poor had grown into something nearly geological in scale. Former soldiers came home from wars to find their farms gone, swallowed up by the estates of wealthy landowners who had been expanding while they were away being heroic. There had already been attempts at reform. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, had tried to redistribute land in the 130s and 120s BCE. Both ended up dead. Tiberius was clubbed to death by senators wielding broken furniture, which tells you quite a lot about the temperature in the room. The Senate, as a body, was not exactly receptive to change. Then came a stretch of essentially back-to-back military strongmen. Marius, Sulla, men who marched their armies on Rome itself, which was technically illegal and also just a very aggressive way to make a political point. Sulla, when he was done with his enemies, posted what were called proscription lists, names on a list. If your name was on it, anyone could kill you and collect a reward. It was the Roman equivalent of turning political disagreement into a game show with very bad prizes. This is the world Julius Caesar grew up in, and it's important because a lot of how Romans felt about Caesar later was shaped by the fact that they had already seen what political violence and one-man rule looked like. They had a frame of reference, and that frame was, to put it gently, deeply traumatic. Caesar was born in 100 BCE, or possibly 102 BCE, ancient record-keeping being what it was. He came from a patrician family, the gens Julia, who claimed descent from the goddess Venus through the Trojan hero Aeneas, because of course they did. Roman aristocratic families were not known for their modesty in the ancestry department. Everyone's great-great-grandmother was apparently a deity. The Julii were patrician, but not particularly wealthy or politically dominant by Caesar's time. They were old money in the sense that the money had mostly been spent. Noble lineage, modest actual clout. This meant Caesar was working with a prestigious name and a lot of ambition and not a whole lot else. His uncle by marriage was, interestingly enough, Gaius Marius, the very general who had already marched on Rome and reshaped the legions into something resembling a professional army. So Caesar grew up in the orbit of one of the most controversial figures of the previous generation. His family connections were to the populares, the faction that, at least rhetorically, aligned itself with the interests of the common people, as opposed to the optimates, who were the conservative senatorial old guard, who believed things were fine exactly as they were. Thank you, and could everyone please stop touching anything? When Sulla took power and started his prescriptions, Caesar was a teenager. Sulla actually put pressure on him to divorce his wife Cornelia, who was the daughter of a prominent populares figure. Caesar refused, which was either deeply romantic or deeply politically calculated, or probably both, because with Caesar it was usually both. Sulla apparently said something along the lines of, and this is paraphrased, the ancient sources are not court transcripts, that he saw many Mariuses in Caesar, meaning, this kid is going to be trouble. He was right, but it would take a while. Caesar spent his 20s doing what ambitious young Romans did, studying rhetoric, going to war, getting captured by pirates, which is a story we absolutely will get to because it is one of the most perfectly Caesar stories in the entire Caesar collection. Building connections, spending money he didn't have, courting popularity, with a combination of genuine political positions and very expensive public entertainment. He was, by most accounts, genuinely charming. Ancient sources describe him as eloquent, witty, sharp. He was reportedly an excellent conversationalist. He had a gift for remembering names. which in a city of hundreds of thousands of politically significant people was not a trivial skill. Cicero, who disagreed with Caesar on nearly everything and spent a remarkable amount of energy being nervous about him, nonetheless admitted that Caesar was one of the finest orators he had ever heard, and Cicero did not hand out compliments easily. But charm in Rome was a double-edged thing. The same qualities that made Caesar appealing to the crowds made him threatening to the Senate, because a man who could talk to everyone, who remembered your name, who gave magnificent games and distributed grain and threw parties and made the plebs feel seen. That man was accumulating social capital at a rate that made the old guard very, very uncomfortable. Let's talk about the pirates, because it's been long enough. Around 75 BCE, Caesar was sailing in the Aegean when his ship was captured by Cilician pirates. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, which was already a significant sum. Caesar, according to the historian Plutarch, writing about a century and a half later, was offended. He told them they had no idea who they were dealing with, and that 20 talents was an insult. He told them to ask for 50. The pirates apparently found this hilarious. They kept him for about 38 days while the ransom was collected. During that time, Caesar played games with them. He wrote poetry and speeches and made them listen. When they weren't sufficiently appreciative, he told them they were Philistines. He joined their exercises. He slept when he wanted to sleep and told them to be quiet. And he told them, repeatedly, in what they presumably took as a joke, that when he was released, he was going to come back, crucify every single one of them, and see to it personally. They laughed. They released him when the money arrived. He immediately went to the nearest coastal city, raised a small fleet, sailed back, captured all of them, and crucified them, everyone. Although, and this is the part of the story that people leave out, he had their throats cut first because he had grown somewhat fond of them over the weeks and thought crucifixion was a little cruel. So he crucified them humanely, if that phrase can be used with a straight face, which it probably cannot. This story was repeated widely in antiquity, and it tells you something about how Caesar was perceived, even in his own lifetime, as someone who was simultaneously joking and completely serious. Who could be warm and sociable and then follow through on something cold and total? The pirate's story became a kind of legend about his character, equal parts charisma and implacability. Back in Rome, Caesar climbed the cursus honorum, the standard sequence of offices a Roman politician was supposed to hold. He was quaestor, then aedile, then praetor, then eventually consul. At each stage, he spent lavishly on public works and games, accumulating debts that would have buried most men, and building a popularity with the Roman masses that alarmed the Senate in roughly the way that a very large dog alarms people who were not expecting a very large dog. As aedile, essentially a magistrate responsible for public buildings, games, and the grain supply, Caesar spent so extravagantly on public spectacles that Romans started talking about him as a man who genuinely cared about them. Whether he did or not is a question historians have argued about for 2,000 years and will probably keep arguing about. His games were spectacular. His public works were real. His distribution of grain to the poor was real. The political benefit to him was also real. As with Caesar, the sincere and the calculating coexisted in a space that made them basically indistinguishable. The Roman plebs, the ordinary citizens, the non-elites, generally adored him. This is well attested across multiple sources. When he came back from his campaigns in Gaul later in his career, crowds turned out in numbers that embarrassed his enemies. When he was assassinated, the reaction of the urban poor was not relief. It was grief and then fury. We'll get there. But for now, let's stay in the earlier career, because the feelings were already complicated before he'd even done most of the things he would eventually become famous for. The Senate, as a body, was suspicious of him early and remained so. This wasn't entirely irrational. He was from the populares tradition. He aligned himself publicly with popular causes. He was too good at talking to people. He spent too much. He accumulated influence too quickly in a system designed to prevent any one man from gaining too much power. A system built specifically in reaction to the old kings. A man like Caesar was architecturally threatening just by existing. The optimates, the conservative faction, watched him the way you watch a cat that has been eyeing your dinner. Technically, nothing has happened yet, but you just know. Chief among his opponents, at least intellectually, was Cato the Younger, a man so committed to the old Roman virtues that he essentially became a philosophical position in human form. Cato was famously incorruptible. He drank, apparently, fairly heavily, but he was incorruptible, which the Romans considered a fair trade. He believed in the Republic with the kind of conviction that left no room for nuance. He distrusted Caesar instinctively and said so publicly and often. The relationship between Caesar and Cato is one of the more interesting dyads in the whole late Republic story. They disagreed on nearly everything. They were temperamentally opposites. Cato was rigid, principled, and pessimistic about human nature. Caesar was flexible, pragmatic, and, in public at least, relentlessly optimistic. Their arguments in the Senate were, by ancient accounts, something to witness. At one point during the Catilinarian conspiracy, a whole separate episode will graze past tonight. Caesar spoke in the Senate in favor of imprisoning the conspirators, rather than executing them without trial, arguing for legal process. Cato responded by arguing for immediate execution. Caesar lost the argument. Cicero executed them. Caesar was later accused, somewhat absurdly, of having been in on the conspiracy himself. He hadn't been, but the accusation stuck around in certain circles because certain circles really wanted it to be true. This is also, by the way, a good illustration of Roman political discourse at the time. If you did something that could be interpreted as sympathetic to someone unpopular, you were immediately suspected of being their secret ally. The paranoia was structural. And Caesar, being Caesar, gave them reasons to be paranoid, not because he was doing secret evil things, mostly, but because he was very clearly playing a long game. Everything he did built towards something. The debts he accumulated were an investment in popularity. The military commands he sought were not just about conquest. They were about building a loyal army. The alliances he made were calculated. He was one of the most strategically self-aware political operators Rome had ever produced, and in a city full of politically self-aware operators, that was saying something. By the time he formed the so-called First Triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus around 60 BCE, an informal alliance of three very powerful men who agreed to stop blocking each other and start cooperating, a lot of Romans had the distinct sense that something had shifted. The Triumvirate was not a formal institution. It had no legal standing. It was just three men who had decided that, together, they controlled enough money, legions, and political influence to steer things how they liked. Which was, if you were a senator who believed in the sanctity of republican institutions, mildly terrifying. And so the feelings about Caesar, even before Gaul, even before the Rubicon, were already a complicated stew. The urban poor liked him. The equestrian class, the middle upper tier of Roman society, was often favorable, since he was good for business and stability, in a way that constant senatorial squabbling was not. A number of senators respected him, worked with him, considered him an effective and brilliant colleague, and another group of senators, led spiritually by men like Cato, and politically by the Optimates faction, considered him the most dangerous man in Rome, not because he had done anything illegal, yet, but because he was very clearly capable of it, and because when you built that much popularity, that much personal loyalty, that much concentrated power, the Republic's rules stopped being a constraint and started being a suggestion. Let's pause here for a moment. Get comfortable. We'll drift into Gaul in just a bit. But first, let's just sit with the image of Rome in 60 BCE. A city of over 1 million people, buzzing with politics and gossip. Watching this man climb, some of them cheering, some of them deeply uneasy, and almost all of them in various ways, not entirely sure what was coming next, which was, honestly, a pretty reasonable position to take. Right, Gaul. If you're feeling drowsy, that's correct. That's the goal. We're going to talk about a military campaign that lasted about 8 years, and we're going to do it in a way that is informative, but not exciting. Think of it as a very well-narrated nature documentary where all the animals are legions and the landscape is modern-day France. Caesar was given command of several provinces in 58 BCE, including Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul. He used a series of tribal migrations and frontier instabilities, some of which he arguably exacerbated, as justification to launch an extended military campaign into the unconquered regions of Gaul to the north. The Gallic Wars, as they came to be known, lasted from 58 to 50 BCE. By the end of them, Caesar had conquered the whole of what is roughly modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Switzerland. He had crossed the Rhine twice and briefly invaded Britain twice, which the Britons apparently found more annoying than catastrophic. The human cost was enormous. Ancient sources, probably exaggerated, but still, suggest that over 1 million Gauls were killed and another million enslaved. Modern historians debate the exact numbers, but the scale of death and displacement was genuinely massive. Caesar wrote about all of this in the third person in his own account, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, with a calm, clinical detachment that is either impressive or chilling, depending on how you feel about that sort of thing. Caesar decided it was necessary to cross the river. Just like that. No fuss, Caesar decided. Caesar crossed. 20,000 people died. Caesar noted this. In Rome, the reaction to the Gallic Wars was, and here's where it gets interesting, genuinely mixed in ways that don't map neatly onto who liked Caesar and who didn't. The military victories were spectacular by any standard. Caesar was sending back dispatches from Gaul that were essentially published political communications, read aloud in public, consumed with the enthusiasm of a serialized adventure story. The campaigns were dramatic. There were sieges and river crossings and climactic battles. The defeat of the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix at the siege of Alesia in 52 BCE was, by any military measure, an extraordinary achievement. Romans loved military victory, the triumph, the ceremonial procession through Rome, awarded to victorious generals, was the highest honor the Republic could bestow, and Caesar was racking up a victory record that demanded one. But, and there is always a but with Caesar, some senators, particularly those already suspicious of him, looked at the Gallic campaign and saw not just victory, but accumulation. Every year in Gaul, Caesar's legions became more specifically his legions. In the Republic, armies were supposed to be instruments of the state. In practice, increasingly, they had become instruments of whoever was paying them and leading them, which in this case was Caesar. His soldiers were loyal to him personally in a way that crossed from military discipline into something more like devotion. This was not an accident. Caesar was an unusually attentive commander. He knew his soldiers by name, a logistical feat in an army of tens of thousands. He led from near the front when battles demanded it. He shared hardships. He rewarded success generously. His officers and men wrote home with a kind of pride in serving under him specifically that goes beyond standard military loyalty. Cicero, watching this from Rome, was increasingly nervous. His letters from this period, and Cicero's letters, are an extraordinary source for this era, detailed and candid in the way that only private correspondence is, show a man trying to be optimistic while being fundamentally not optimistic. He liked Caesar personally. He thought Caesar was brilliant. He also thought Caesar was going to break something important. The political situation in Rome itself during the Gallic years was deteriorating. The first triumvirate was fraying. Crassus, the money man of the three, died spectacularly and catastrophically at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, defeated by the Parthians in a military campaign that went about as badly as a military campaign can go. So that left two: Pompey and Caesar, both powerful, both with armies, both with ambitions, and the senatorial faction, the Optimates, moved very deliberately to position Pompey as the champion of the Republic against the threat of Caesar because, and this is a lovely piece of political irony, Pompey had done exactly the same accumulation of power and personal army loyalty that Caesar was doing slightly earlier, and they had condemned him for it too, and now they were rehabilitating him as the defender of tradition. This is the sort of thing that made Romans drink. By 50 BCE, Caesar's command in Gaul was ending. The Senate debated whether to allow him to stand for consul in absentia, meaning whether he could run for the next office while still technically in command of his armies, or whether he had to return to Rome as a private citizen, at which point he would be immediately prosecuted by his enemies for various alleged illegalities during his time as governor. Caesar asked for the right to stand in absentia. The Senate, pushed hard by the anti-Caesar faction, refused. Negotiations went back and forth for months. Various compromise proposals were floated, rejected, floated again. Cicero tried to mediate. Various tribunes tried to protect Caesar's interests, using their veto power. Things were tense in the specifically polite way that Roman politics was tense. Everyone in togas, everyone choosing their words carefully, everyone very aware that one wrong move could tip from political argument into something more drastic. In January of 49th BCE, the Senate passed a final ultimatum. Caesar was to disband his armies and return. His tribunes, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, attempted to veto this and were driven from Rome by the Optimates faction, who had essentially suspended normal operations and declared a state of emergency. The tribunes fled to Caesar's camp, and Caesar, who had been waiting near the Rubicon, the small river in northern Italy that marked the boundary between the provinces and Italy proper, and across which no Roman general was permitted to march with an army, considered his options. What happened next is so famous that crossing the Rubicon has entered every language as a phrase meaning a point of no return. Caesar crossed with his army. Supposedly, he said something. Ancient sources give various versions. Something to the effect of the die is cast, a gambling metaphor, very Caesar. And Rome, on hearing this, had approximately 17 different reactions simultaneously. A significant portion of the senatorial class, including Pompey and the Optimates leadership, fled the city immediately, which was, depending on your perspective, either prudent caution or a spectacular admission that they had been bluffing about their ability to actually resist him. Pompey retreated to Greece. The Senate relocated with him. Caesar marched into Rome. And here is where the feelings of ordinary Romans become particularly interesting to look at. The city did not riot. The city did not rise up in spontaneous defense of the Republic. People watched and waited and, for the most part, went on with their lives in the way that populations do when they're tired and uncertain and the fighting is happening elsewhere. Caesar entered Rome and was, by all accounts, received without overt hostility. He was careful not to sack the city. He was careful not to murder his political enemies. He unlocked the state treasury, which Pompey had inconveniently not taken with him in the rush to leave, and used it to fund his campaign. The lack of an immediate popular uprising against him is itself a data point about how Romans felt. The Republic, by 49 BCE, had been so battered by decades of violence, proscriptions, political dysfunction, and civil conflict that a significant portion of the population had arrived at a kind of exhausted pragmatism. Caesar was at least competent. Caesar had, thus far, not murdered anyone unnecessarily. Caesar was, in various ways, the person they'd been watching for a decade and knew the personality of, as opposed to an unknown quantity. This is not the same as enthusiasm, but it is a kind of tolerance that mattered. The civil war that followed was not short, but it was decisive. Pompey was defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE in Greece. He fled to Egypt, where he was murdered on the beach by agents of the Egyptian court before Caesar even arrived. A killing Caesar apparently did not want and was genuinely upset by, according to sources. Though how upset he was versus how much he performed. Being upset is the kind of question ancient historians enjoy arguing about. Caesar spent time in Egypt. He got involved, productively from his perspective, in the Egyptian civil war between Ptolemy III and his sister Cleopatra. He sided with Cleopatra. He and Cleopatra became romantically involved, which the Roman public found interesting, titillating, and in some quarters concerning. She was foreign. She was a queen in the absolute sense. She was brilliant and politically sophisticated, and she was, in the eyes of certain Roman moralists, exactly the kind of foreign entanglement that respectable Roman men were not supposed to allow themselves to be distracted by. Caesar, characteristically, did not seem to care about these concerns. He went on. He mopped up remaining Pompeian resistance in Africa and Spain. He won. He came back to Rome. And now we get to the period that really tells us how Romans felt about him, because now he was there, in person, in power, and they had to actually deal with that. Caesar returned to Rome victorious and celebrated 4 triumphs in the autumn of 46 BCE. 4, because he had won 4 distinct wars: Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. The triumphs were massive, enormous processions, with captive kings and mountains of treasure, and thousands of soldiers, and the visual spectacle that Rome did better than almost any other civilization. The crowds for these events were immense. People came from all over Italy to watch. The Pontic triumph included a float with just 3 words on it: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered, referring to his campaign against Pharnaces of Pontus, which had been so fast and total that the 3-word summary was genuinely accurate. The crowd, by all accounts, loved it. It was the perfect Caesar move. Self-aggrandizing, and also kind of funny. He was appointed dictator, then dictator again, and again. Eventually, in 44 BCE, dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, forever, which was not technically how the Roman dictatorship was supposed to work. The office was designed as a temporary emergency measure, 6 months maximum for genuine crises. Forever was a significant addition. The Senate, or what remained of a Senate, now substantially filled with Caesar's appointees and allies, kept voting him more honors, more powers, more titles. Statues were erected. His image was put on coins while he was still alive, which Roman tradition had not previously permitted. His birthday became a public holiday. Priests of his personal cult were established, and the question of how Romans felt about all of this is genuinely fascinating and genuinely contested. Let's take the honors one by one, because the reaction to them was not monolithic. Among the population at large, the urban poor, the Italian peasantry, who had benefited from his land reforms, the veterans of his legions, who had received generous land grants, the response to Caesar's accumulation of honors was largely either positive or indifferent. He had done things for these people, concrete things, land distributions, debt relief, the Julian calendar, which he reformed with the help of Egyptian astronomers, and which is, with minor modifications, the calendar you are currently using, the reorganization of the grain dole, the founding of colonies for his veterans. These were not symbolic gestures. They were material changes in real people's lives, and for the people whose lives had improved under him, the question of whether his power was constitutionally appropriate was, understandably, somewhat abstract. But among the senatorial class, even those who had accepted his rule, even those who had been pardoned by him and returned to positions of influence, the situation was more complicated. Caesar had a policy of clementia, mercy. Rather than proscribing his enemies after defeating them, he pardoned them. Marcus Brutus, who had fought for Pompey, was pardoned and actually given significant responsibilities. Gaius Cassius, another Pompeian, was similarly pardoned and appointed. This was both politically smart and apparently genuinely in line with Caesar's own inclinations. He did not seem to enjoy killing his peers when he didn't have to. But clementia has a complicated dynamic. When a man has the power to kill you and chooses not to, you are in his debt in a way that is not comfortable. Roman aristocratic culture had very specific ideas about obligation and honor. To owe your life to a man who chose to spare you was not an easy position. It placed you in a hierarchy you had not chosen and could not reciprocate. It was generous, and it was also, whether intentionally or not, a demonstration of just how absolute Caesar's position had become. Some of those he pardoned were quietly and deeply resentful, not because they wanted to be dead, but because the entire situation made clear, in the most personal possible way, that the republic they believed in was functionally over. They were alive, not because the laws protected them, but because one man had decided they should live. Cicero, in his letters and speeches from this period, is an extraordinary window entombing in the ruins. Cicero, in his letters and speeches from this period, is an extraordinary window into this ambivalence. He accepted Caesar's dominance. He attended his dinners. He wrote to friends with a kind of tired resignation. What else is there to do, really? He expressed admiration for Caesar's intellect, even while mourning the Republic. His letters from 46 and 45 BCE have a quality of a man who has made his peace with a situation he cannot change, and is trying to find something intellectually interesting in the ruins. There were, however, things Caesar did in this period that genuinely alienated even relatively friendly observers. One frequently cited example: at some point in early 44 BCE, a group of senators came to him to present yet another slate of honors. Caesar received them sitting down, which does not sound like a significant act of disrespect, unless you understand Roman custom, in which case it was a pointed and public one. Senators were owed certain gestures of respect. Caesar did not stand. Whether he was distracted, whether he was making a point, whether he was unwell, the ancient sources disagree. The reaction was immediate and negative. There's another incident around the Lupercalia festival of 44 BCE. The Lupercalia was an ancient fertility ritual, somewhat rowdy by Roman standards, during which men ran through the streets in minimal clothing, doing various ceremonial things. Mark Antony, who was a consul and Caesar's close ally, ran up to Caesar during the festivities and offered him a diadem, a royal headband, one of the symbols of kingship, 3 times, according to the ancient accounts. Each time Caesar pushed it away. The crowd cheered every time he refused. This has been interpreted in wildly different ways ever since. Was Caesar refusing the crown genuinely? Was it a performance to gauge public reaction? Was Antony doing this with Caesar's prior knowledge, hoping he'd accept? Was Antony going rogue and Caesar was genuinely annoyed? Ancient sources are inconsistent. Modern historians pick their preferred reading and argue for it with varying degrees of confidence. What is consistent across sources is that the moment was deeply charged and that the refusal did not fully reassure the people who were watching it with unease, because whether he wanted the crown formally or not, the actual situation, one man with more power than any Roman had held since the kings, was not substantially altered by the theatrical rejection of a piece of headgear. The conspiracy to kill him formed among the senators, who had decided that this was not fixable by ordinary political means. There were about 60 of them, ultimately led, at least in terms of moral authority, by Marcus Brutus, the man Caesar had trusted, the man whose mother, Julius Caesar, had had a long relationship with, the man whom Caesar, by some accounts, genuinely cared about. Cassius was the practical organizer. Others joined for various reasons: ideological, personal, motivated by grievance, motivated by ambition, or genuinely motivated by the belief that the Republic could not survive what Caesar represented. The Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE. The Senate meeting in the Theater of Pompey, the regular Senate House, was under renovation. Caesar arrived. The conspirators approached. One took hold of his toga, and then the knives. 23 stab wounds, according to the physician who later examined the body. Only one of them, a historian later determined, was actually fatal. The rest were, in a sense, the conspirators ensuring that they were all complicit. Everyone had to strike. Everyone had to share the act. Caesar fell at the base of a statue of Pompey. Whether history invented this detail or it's accurate, it's very good imagery for people who enjoy that sort of thing. Let's settle in a bit more. We're past the assassination now, and what happens next is really the clearest window we have into how Romans actually felt about Julius Caesar. Because you can say many things about the conspirators. You can call them liberators, which is what they called themselves. You can call them murderers, which is what Caesar's supporters called them. What you cannot call them is particularly good at planning. They had spent considerable effort planning the assassination itself. They had spent almost no effort planning what would happen after it. Their assumption, and this is a charitable reading, of what was genuinely a catastrophic miscalculation, was that once Caesar was dead, the Republic would naturally reassert itself. The Senate would resume its normal functions. People would be relieved. There would perhaps be a brief period of adjustment, and then things would go back to normal. What actually happened was different. Caesar's body was carried to his home. His will was read. He had left his gardens to the people of Rome as a public park. He had left every Roman citizen a personal bequest of a substantial sum of money. Whether you admired him or not, this was, as a final public act, exactly the kind of gesture that made him who he was. The conspirators went to the Capitol expecting to be received as heroes. They were not received as heroes. They were received with a silence that was worse than anger. People didn't rush out to celebrate. The city was quiet, with something that was not quite grief and not quite shock, more like a kind of collective holding of breath. Mark Antony, who had survived the assassination by being kept out of the room on various pretexts, obtained Caesar's body and arranged a public funeral. He delivered the funeral oration in the Roman Forum. The speech, as reported in the ancient sources, most famously in Plutarch and in Shakespeare's version, which takes considerable artistic license, probably was not the elaborate rhetorical performance Shakespeare imagined, but it was effective. Antony read Caesar's will aloud. He displayed the toga Caesar had been wearing, with the stab wounds. The crowd, already emotionally volatile, responded with what the sources describe as grief and then fury. They burned the body in the forum. They tore up benches and stalls and threw them on the pyre. Then they took torches and went looking for the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius, and most of the other conspirators, had already fled Rome. The mob that went looking for them attacked a man named Cinna by mistake. He was a poet named Cinna, not the conspiring senator, also named Cinna, and killed him anyway, which is a deeply Roman sort of accident and also a testament to how little nuanced judgment an angry mob is capable of. The conspirators never returned to Rome. They went east, raised armies, and were eventually defeated by Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir, at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. Brutus and Cassius both died there. The republic they had tried to restore did not return. What the popular reaction to Caesar's assassination tells us about how Romans felt is, I think, the heart of the whole question. The senatorial conspirators had assumed that the public would share their institutional concerns, that the danger Caesar represented to the republic was legible to everyone, that the accumulated honors and the dictatorship perpetua and the sitting down when senators came to present him with things, that all of this was as alarming to the ordinary Roman as it was to the men in togas who had spent their lives invested in the Senate's primacy. It wasn't, or rather, not in the same way, to the urban poor. Caesar had been a benefactor. To his veterans, he had been their general. To a significant portion of the Italian population, he had been the most competent and effective administrator they had seen in their lifetimes. The abstractions of republican government, the proper balance of power, the traditional limits on individual authority, were genuine and important ideas, but they competed with the very concrete experience of whether your life had gotten better or worse under a given political arrangement. And for a lot of people, things had been materially better under Caesar than they had been under the endless instability of the late Republic. This is not an endorsement of one-man rule. To be clear, this is an observation about what people prioritize when they're making sense of political change in real time. They do it with the information and the experiences they have, not with perfect historical perspective. There were also Romans who were genuinely horrified by the assassination, not for reasons of loyalty to Caesar specifically, but for reasons of simple civic dread. Whatever problems Caesar represented, he had been maintaining order. He had been preventing the civil wars from restarting. Killing him without any plan for what came next was, as became immediately apparent, not a restoration of stability, but an invitation to more instability, which is exactly what followed. The years after 44 BCE were among the most violent and chaotic in Roman history. Antony and Octavian initially cooperated, then fought, formed the Second Triumvirate, with Lepidus, conducted proscriptions, posting those death lists again, the same tool Sulla had used, and killed among others Cicero, whose head and hands were nailed to the rostra in the Forum, a final indignity for a man who had spent his career speaking from that platform. By the time Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, finished defeating Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BCE and declared the wars over and became the first Roman emperor, he did so by very carefully not calling himself king, not calling himself dictator, maintaining the forms of republican government, while completely emptying them of their substance. He had learned, watching what happened to his uncle, that the trappings mattered enormously to Romans, even when the reality had already changed. He declared Julius Caesar a god, Divus Julius, the divine Julius, and he himself became Divi Filius, son of the divine, which was a very smooth piece of political theology. The deification of Caesar tells us something interesting about the feelings, or the attempted management of feelings, in the generation after his death. Augustus needed Caesar to be a hero. He needed the story of Caesar's life and death to be legible as a martyrdom that justified Augustus's own power. The conspirators needed to be villains. The grief of the Roman people needed to be honored and channeled. And so, history, officially, in the version the imperial government promoted, decided that Caesar had been beloved, had been a force for good, had been struck down by selfish aristocrats who feared him and had been vindicated by the success of the empire that followed. Which is not entirely wrong, but it's also not the whole picture. Let's drift sideways for a moment, because to answer the question of how ancient Romans felt about Julius Caesar, we have to reckon with the fact that almost everything we know about Caesar comes from sources that had strong reasons to tell the story a certain way. Caesar's own writings, the Gallic Wars commentaries, and the Civil War account are remarkable documents. They're clear, precise, and extremely readable. They're also written in the third person, which creates a deliberate documentary quality, as if Caesar is simply recording facts rather than advocating for himself. This is, to put it generously, a rhetorical choice. Everything in the Gallic Wars that reflects well on Caesar is simply presented as objective fact. Everything that might reflect badly is absent or reframed. Sallust, the historian, was a Caesar ally. His histories reflect that. Livy wrote under Augustus, who had every reason to want Caesar portrayed as heroic. Plutarch, writing his lives about a century and a half later, was Greek, was drawing on a mixture of sources, was interested in moral character and comparative biography, and while he's enormously valuable, has his own interpretive biases. Suetonius, writing slightly later still, was a chronicler with a weakness for personal anecdotes, some reliable, some clearly repeated gossip, and a tendency to collect salacious details about imperial figures that may or may not represent accurate history. Cicero is the closest thing we have to a contemporary voice that is both extensive and independent-minded. His letters and speeches are candid in ways that official histories are not. He was conflicted about Caesar throughout. He respected his mind. He mourned the Republic. He found the whole situation deeply depressing. He tried to stay relevant and largely failed. He was eventually killed for it. Appian and Cassius Dio, writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, had the benefit of more sources, but the distance of centuries and the perspective of the imperial period, in which the Republic's end was settled fact, and Caesar's role in it was thoroughly mythologized. The point of all this is not to throw up our hands and say, we can't know anything. We can know quite a lot, but we should hold it with appropriate looseness, recognizing that the picture we have of how Romans felt about Caesar has been filtered through 2,000 years of people who needed him to be one thing or another. The imperial propaganda machine needed him to be a hero and a martyr. Later, Republican idealists in Rome and later in European political thought sometimes needed him to be a villain. The conspirators as noble defenders of freedom was a narrative that had real longevity. Shakespeare's Brutus is a good man in a terrible situation. That version of the story had a long run. In the Renaissance and afterward, every political faction that had a use for Roman history shaped their reading of Caesar accordingly. The absolute monarchists loved him. The Republicans feared him. The humanists admired his writing. The moralists worried about his ambition. None of them, of course, were actually asking the Romans, and the Romans themselves, to the extent we can recover their voices, were not a monolith. The freedman who received his bequest from Caesar's will felt one thing. The senator who had to accept a pardon from a man who had marched his army into Italy felt another. The veteran who was given land in a colony felt another. The Gallic tribesman, whose town had been sacked, felt another still, though that voice is largely absent from our sources. History, written by the victors, and all that. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: Caesar was genuinely popular with large sections of Roman society, the urban poor, the soldiers, many in the Italian peninsula who had grown tired of senatorial dysfunction. He was genuinely alarming to a significant portion of the senatorial class, not because he was obviously evil, but because he represented something their entire political culture had been designed to prevent. He was deeply respected as a military commander and an administrator across a wide spectrum. He was distrusted as a person by those who felt he was never not calculating. He was loved with something approaching genuine emotion by his veterans. He was resented with something approaching genuine despair by those who believed in the Republic and watched it end. He was not uniformly adored. He was not uniformly hated. He was, and this might be the most honest summary possible, a man of extraordinary capability, operating in a broken system whose rise both reflected and accelerated that system's collapse, and about whom virtually everyone had an opinion, and almost no one had a simple one. Let's do the last float now. We're almost done. The candle's burning low. The city of Rome has receded into the middle distance, all marble and torchlight and complicated feelings. Caesar has been dead for 2,000 years, and people are still arguing about him, which is, honestly, a testament to something. Most people don't generate 2 millennia of argument. Most people don't have their name become a title. Kaiser in German, Tsar in Russian, both derived from Caesar. Most people don't end up in Shakespeare and on coins, and in the names of surgical procedures, and in the phrase you use when you've made a decision you can't take back. The Romans who lived through him never reached consensus. The historians who followed never reached consensus. Enlightenment thinkers, Romantic historians, 20th century political theorists, nobody reached consensus. Some things, though, do seem solid. He was brilliant. The evidence for this is too overwhelming to dismiss. The military record, the political record, the writing, the legal and administrative reforms. They don't happen without genuine intelligence, operating at a high level. He was ambitious in a way that was unusual, even by Roman standards, which is saying something, because Roman aristocratic culture considered ambition a positive virtue. Caesar's ambition had a quality that alarmed even people who shared it. It had no visible ceiling. He was, in his personal relationships, apparently capable of genuine warmth. The stories of his soldiers' loyalty, the grief of his freed slaves, the genuine fondness described in accounts of his relationships. These suggest a man who was not simply performing human connection, but occasionally actually having it. He was also willing to do terrible things when he calculated they were necessary. The Gallic campaigns are not separable from who he was. The million or so people who died or were enslaved in the service of Caesar's political career were real people. Their absence from most celebratory accounts of Caesar's genius is a silence worth noticing. And the Romans who cheered at his triumph and wept at his funeral and tore apart the city in their grief, they were responding to the Caesar they had experienced, the one who gave them grain and games and money and spectacle, not to the Caesar the Gauls had experienced. Most of them didn't know that Caesar very well, and wouldn't have had the framework to think about it even if they had. This is not unusual. This is how it almost always works with powerful figures. The people whose lives are improved by them experience one person. The people whose lives are destroyed by them experience another. And the historical record, which tends to be written by people closer to the first group, reflects that imbalance. The Romans who loved Caesar loved him for real reasons. The Romans who feared him for real reasons. The Romans who killed him for reasons that were partly principled and partly personal and partly a miscalculation of breathtaking scale. And the Romans who mourned him mourned something that was real, even if it was also complicated. The loss of a man who had, whatever his flaws, made them feel like the city was being run by someone capable. What came after him? Decades of civil war, rivers of blood, the eventual slide into what we call the Roman Empire, was not simply his fault. The Republic was already broken before he arrived. He didn't break it so much as he was the final and decisive weight on a structure that had been cracking for a century. But he also didn't save it, and he knew he wasn't going to save it. The dictatorship Perpetua was not the move of a man who thought the Republic was recoverable. It was the move of a man who had decided that the form would have to change to preserve the function. Whether he was right about that, whether the empire that followed was better than the Republic, that preceded it, whether the 40 or so years of Augustan stability were worth the preceding decades of blood. These are questions Romans argued about, and we are still arguing about, and probably will argue about for another 2,000 years. For now, though, it's late. The city of Rome is quiet. The Forum is empty. The statues stand in the moonlight, marble and still, and somewhere under a thin layer of centuries, and archaeology is the place where Caesar fell, and where they burned him, and where the crowd stood in the night around the fire. They were scared, they were grieving, they were angry, they were uncertain about what came next, which is, if you strip away the togas and the temples and the Latin, a fairly universal human experience. So tonight, as you drift off, think about that. Think about a city full of people with complicated feelings about a complicated man trying to make sense of something they couldn't quite name. It's not that different from now. It never really is. Sleep well. We'll talk again soon.